Shalom and welcome. My name is Avraham Ben Shalom, and today I'm going to be discussing a very important topic, which is the commandment of Lishmor et HaShabbat, to keep the Sabbath. So, what is it that we need to know about keeping Shabbat, and what is it we need to understand about the issues of Shabbat? Well, one of the most important things we have to begin to learn to understand is the fact that the Sabbath, because it is such a common issue by which we observe and keep, since it's a weekly event that takes place, we have to understand from the Torah, and we have to understand from the commandments, that according to the Torah, there is two things that we need to understand. They are the laws by which prohibit us from performing specific acts on the Sabbath, and there are laws by which we are permissible to do on the Sabbath. And for most people who read the Brit Chadashah and are not being taught properly, will find that if you look deeper into the words of the Brit Chadashah, what Mashiach Yehoshua says and teaches us, he teaches us exactly how to get back and to restore our Shabbat keeping so that we are walking properly as is commanded by the Torah. And, this is one of the things that's the problem with, the most Messianics is the fact that you get involved in first acknowledging and understanding that the Sabbath needs to be kept, but then it stops, and there isn't really a full understanding of how to keep Shabbat, except from a very simple, basic standpoint, which many people might start by saying that I don't go to work on the Sabbath, and that's just kind of how it ends, is that point. But we're going to be looking in the Brit Chadashah, and we're going to be going through different things in the Torah in order to learn how to properly observe Shabbat. And to begin to discuss things, we're going to focus first on the fact of what is the Torah teaching us that you can do on the Sabbath. Well, one thing we need to understand is the fact that when we look at the issues of Torah law, we have to understand that the Torah for itself is one big, massive legal book that gives us many different parameters by which, in certain circumstances, something would be illegal, but in other circumstances, that thing that would have been illegal in a normal circumstance is not illegal in this circumstance. And this only comes from understanding the Torah and understanding the complexities of the Torah and how the Torah works and functions. And that's why when we find, questions that people ask, if I was out there in the woods and it was all of a sudden a big snowstorm were to come, and I was to be stuck in a place where if I didn't have heat that I would die, what would I be permissible to do? Because the Torah says you should not kindle fire, am I allowed to kindle fire? And the answer is yes, the Torah permits that we may do certain acts, and those certain acts are only incumbent upon the situational need and the situational requirement. Now, it's very specific and it's very stringent with regard to it, and this is the issue that we have to understand. But this is what the Torah has within the structure of it. And we have to understand the fact that only under certain circumstances would the Torah permit the issue to exist. And so we're going to understand that from the words of Mashiach Yehoshua, that he teaches us that this issue is an issue by which, the subject would be regarded as, for example, the breaking of something that you're not held guilty for breaking. And this specifically comes from when Mashiach Yehoshua speaks about the Kohanim and how the Kohanim violate the Sabbath, but they themselves are found guiltless because of what they are doing. So without further ado, let's go into Matthew. This is Matthew 21. We're going to read verses 1 through 15, and we're going to focus upon what Mashiach Yehoshua teaches us so that we can understand, as well as understanding the mindset and the methodology of the belief and understanding that the Pharishees, the Pharisees had, as to the contrast of what was really going on, so we can understand the Brit Chadashah correctly and understand it properly. So it says in Matthew 12 verse 1, it says, "At that time Yehoshua went through the grain fields on the Shabbat, and his disciples, the Talmidim, were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat." The Brit Chadashah tells us that the reason why the Talmidim were actually hungry was because they had been fasting for a while. And therefore, during this time period of the Sabbath, the hunger of that time of having fasted for what they had been going through had seized upon them, and so therefore Mashiach Yehoshua taught them to pluck the grains of the actual grain stalks in the field with their hands, and that if they would pluck it and remove the different coverings and eat it, that it is permissible. So when the Pharisees saw, as we see in verse 2, it says, "But when the Parashim saw, they said to him, 'Look, your Talmidim are doing what is unlawful to do on the Shabbat.'" Now, the issue of we find here is, why is it the Parashim were even thinking in any way, shape, or form that this was unlawful to be done on the Shabbat? And that goes because they had two things that we find that was at play here. Number one, the Parashim were constantly seeking to find ways to discredit Mashiach Yehoshua by creating even fallacy arguments in the midst of the times that they were confronting Mashiach Yehoshua, so that the Talmidim would question the validity of what Mashiach Yehoshua was doing. And that was one of the tactics of the Parashim, was to constantly seek out ways of discrediting what Mashiach Yehoshua said and did, because they just wanted to make people not believe in what he was saying and teaching, because Mashiach Yehoshua constantly was correcting the interpretations of the Parashim and showing them that they were wrong. And if you put yourself back in that time period and you think about it, that would have been quite confusing for people at the time period to see a man standing up and constantly changing the interpretations of things, which at the time, if you were caught up in the interpretations of the Parashim, you might have thought that what he was doing was constantly breaking and refuting and being rebellious. You might have looked at it from that perspective, and questioning it. And of course, this would have been a very difficult thing for those people who were very much caught up at the time period of what was going on in relationship to the teachings of the Parashim, who were the head of the Sanhedrin at the time. And this is something that you have to understand, is the fact that the Torah does require us and demand that we submit and uphold to the teachings of what the Sanhedrin says. And so this is exactly where a lot of people at the time who were surrounding these events were very much zealous for. But now here's a man who comes out of nowhere, who all of a sudden is violating these things in their eyes, and they're vehemently angry over the issue of why is he violating these things. But here's the kicker. You see, the Torah tells us that the sages can be wrong. And the Torah tells us that if the sages are wrong, that commonly what God will do is he rises up a prophet. And the prophet will do the things that's very contrary to that which is the knowledge and understanding and the thinking and the keeping of the time and the period and the people. And this is the thing that causes such a hardship for people, is because the Torah requires a few things for us to understand. Number one, the Torah requires us that every generation understand and searches out the Torah for themselves. That's one of the first thing, which means I'm I'm not to just hold to what the teachings of the sages are saying to me on the time period that I'm living in, but I'm also to research and search them out to see if this indeed is true, and to make sure that I understand for myself that what the things that we are doing in the time period we're living in is the correct version, and that I'm not being led astray, and that I'm not being taught things incorrectly. And this is incumbent upon every generation. Every generation has to understand the very things that the Bible says. So when we're looking at the issue that we see here, in which the Torah speaks very clearly, we see the fact that in the Brit Chadashah, Mashiach Yehoshua is doing that very thing. He's showing the Talmidim that there was a very huge discrepancy with regard to the teachings that was going on during the time period, by which here in this passage we see that the Talmidim, because of the issue of what the scripture says with relation to how they're observing Shabbat, was not correct in the interpretational eyes of the Parashim. The Parashim, they were not understanding the Torah because they weren't learning the Malachot properly. They didn't learn the Malacha of Shabbat properly in order to do this, while some, when they heard it, they were very convicted in heart about the fact of seeing that they were wrong, and they wanted to act as if, what he was saying wasn't true, and so they, would act in a way that looked like, by their words and their statements, that as if he was violating the Shabbat. But we find, if we look at in Devarim 23 verses 25, one of the Malacha of Shabbat, the Torah tells us how is it that we are to observe the understanding and the preservation of the Sabbath, so that we are not violating the Sabbath, but that rather we are preserving and keeping the Sabbath, so that what things are done we may do, and what things are refrained from we are refraining from. And so in this passage, as it says, this is in Devarim 23 and verse 25, it says, Ki tavo bekerem recha, when you come into the vineyard of your fellow, va'achalta, you shall eat anavim, the grapes, kanafshtecha, according to your soul, kanafshecha, according to your soul. Whichever your soul desires, the Torah says you can go into the field of your fellow in which he has the kerem, the vineyard, sha'avaicha, and you should be sated, el kalecha, and unto your vessel, lotiten, you should not place. So we learn from the Torah here, in this part, that it was permissible to go into a person's field to eat according to the satisfaction of your belly, so that your hunger would cease and desist. But you could not take things from your actual friends or your neighbor's vineyard, by which you be placing items inside of a basket, and this is where we get the gathering that's prohibited on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to gather grapes on the Sabbath. Now, if we understand also too the issue by which we're going to find, I'm going to read down next to the next verse in 26. It says, Ki tavo bekamata, when you come bekamat, when you come into the standing grain reicha of your fellow, v'katafta, and you pluck off mililot, the grains, beyadecha, with your hand, v'chermesh, but with the sickle, lo tanif, you shall not swing, al kamat reicha, upon the standing grain of your fellow. So the Torah tells us that the prohibition for the Sabbath was here, as we find in the Torah, is the using of a sickle, by which, if taking a sickle and chopping down the standing grain, that this was the malacha that was asur, forbidden. Whereas if you were to pluck it with your hand, just as if you were to pluck grapes off of the grapevine with your hand, this is called the malacha that is mutar. This is malacha that is permissible, which means you would not be in any way, shape, or form in violation of the Torah for going to a grape field and plucking the grapes, but rather it would only be forbidden if you were chopping the grapevines off and gathering it in a basket, or if you were gathering grapes in a basket. This is asur, forbidden. So if you took it in your hand, however, as the Torah says here, this is called a malacha that is mutar. This is what you can do on the Sabbath, and this is what we find when we're looking at the Brit Chadashah, where the Talmidim, they took the grains and they plucked it in their hand, and see the Parashim of the time, they weren't as knowledgeable of this Torah law, and matter of fact, they had a very stringent attitude by which what they did is they even said that it was forbidden to do this. And so Mashiach Yehoshua was showing the actual Torah laws in a proper manner so that the Parashim would see and understand, and then they would also change and do teshuvah and teach the people correctly. But of course, the Parashim, they didn't like that version, and so they constantly were up in arms against Mashiach Yehoshua. So when we go forward, we find that he says in verse 2, he says that the Parashim, were discrediting Mashiach by trying to tell the Talmidim, but what they were doing was not lawful to be done on Shabbat. Now, of course, why are they focusing on the Talmidim? Why aren't they focusing on Mashiach Yehoshua here? Is because it was the attitude of the Parashim to try to discredit within the ears of the Talmidim so that they would not listen to Mashiach Yehoshua, and hopefully their attitude was thinking maybe they would get them to become zealous for them. That was the mentality of the Parashim, whereas we find that this is why Mashiach Yehoshua stands up when he hears that the Talmidim are being messed with, that he says in verse 3, "Have you not read that David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate of the bread in the presence of God, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the Kohanim." Now, of course, here, when he mentioned this in the ears of the Parashim, he was rebuking them. And this was an absolute rebuke because he pointed at the issue of what happened with regard to David. And that according to the time that we read in the Tanakh, Evyatar, who was the Kohen HaGadol at the time, he was the one who knew that in the Torah, that because of the issue of David and his men, because they were in a state of tzamim, they were fasting, that he, in this point, knew and understood that this was a issue of pekuach nefesh, the sanctity of life, and therefore he knew that it was permissible to actually give them the showbread because it was a pekuach nefesh issue, and that was all they had. Now, if they had other food, they would have given him the other food, and in this case, it would have been forbidden for David HaMelech to have any of the showbread. But because the lechem panim was all they had, Evyatar basically knew that from the Torah that there would be no violation, there would be no negative thing that would fall upon them, because this is an issue of what is called the sanctity of life, which is in Hebrew we call it pekuach nefesh. And the issue that many people get caught up in is the fact of not understanding that this is an issue by which the Torah teaches, and that if you study the Torah properly and correctly, you will find that the Torah does teach that the issue of pekuach nefesh always supersedes the issue of what is going on. So, if a person, for example, breaks their leg, yes, you can take them to the hospital, and yes, you can have the doctors work on him. And yes, you can violate what normally would be forbidden, such as traveling in your car on the Sabbath, and of course carrying things on the Sabbath, because here you would have to take different items with you because of the issue of him being caught in this situation where he's being hurt, and you have to rush him off to the hospital. However, on a normal case, it would be forbidden, and that's why the Torah regards this under the case and laws that the Torah gives, what is permissible and when and how and what time and what circumstance does it exist, and when it doesn't exist, that this would actually be forbidden. And so from here, as we go on, we find that when Mashiach Yehoshua brought this issue up, he was rebuking the Parashim because of what it is that they were saying, and he was reminding them of what the Tanakh says, so that they would go back and rethink their thinking of this issue of what they were condemning improperly. As he goes on to say in verse 5, or have you not read in the Torah how on the Shabbat the Kohanim in the temple profane the Shabbat but are guiltless? And of course, the point that he was making here is the fact that the Parashim would know that it actually is given as a Torah law that the Kohanim are to actually do certain things in the temple, such as kindling fire and offering up animals for sacrifice, and to cutting the animals and to offer the incense. And this specific thing, which normally for us outside, for us who are not a part of the physical temple service, would be forbidden for us on the Sabbath. But however, because they were specifically commanded to do this specific act, by which the Torah says that the Kohanim were required specifically to do in the temple, the Torah therefore says that they are not actually in violation of the Torah. And therefore this is what the Torah teaches in regard to this. And then of course he goes to say in verse 6, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here, and if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Now, of course, this is a very important thing that he's saying here, because what he's quoting from here in Matthew 12 verse 7, this is exactly coming from the prophet that he's quoting here. So you can see that a few issues you find in this passage here is, number one, in this passage, he's telling specifically of the issue of the Tanakh passage that deals with David, and what happened with David, and what was going on with David HaMelech, and the men that were with him. And then of course, you have the next thing, which is the issue of what the Bible tells us with regard to the Kohanim, and what it is that the Kohanim were permitted to do, and therefore pointing at the fact that the Torah does allow the Kohanim to specifically partake of certain things, which in other cases it would only be forbidden specifically upon us, where it was given as a commandment. And so therefore, even though they say, even though they're doing these things, it is permissible because the Torah gave it as a commandment for them to do. Now, when we look at the issue of the passage, he says, for I desire I desire mercy, not sacrifice, that you would not have condemned the guiltless. Takes us back to Hosea 6:6. And if we look at Hosea 6:6, we have to come and read Hosea 6:6 to understand what this passage was referring to. What was he mean when he said this? So I'm going to start with Hosea 1 and read through so that you can get to Hosea 6:6 to see the context of what's being said here. For he says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us. He has that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will build us up. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. let us know, let us press on to know the Lord, for going on and sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains and the water the earth. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like the morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment go forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. And here we find that the issue is you see what Hosea is telling us is he's telling us that what it was the mouth of the prophets was to restore the truth. And why was so people would not be caught up in sin. And therefore, because him teaching the Talmudim about properly observing the Shabbat, the Talmudim now were observing the Shabbat with complete observance and the same severity of all the things that are regarded to and are needed to obey and keep the Sabbath. And so by him saying this, he was rebuking them for trying to get these people to be thinking that they were sinning, because he had restored correctly the way in which they were to keep the Shabbat, and so they were guiltless in what they were doing. And then he goes to verse 8 and says, for the Son of Man is Lord of Shabbat. Mashiach Yehoshua says very clearly, the Son of Man is Lord of Shabbat, which means literally that Mashiach Yehoshua is telling us that he is the master of all of the laws of Shabbat. And as we see here, we see that Mashiach Yehoshua, he was rebuking the Parashim, because the Parashim were not listening to the very problems that they were causing. They wanted to cause them to be looked at as if they were in violation, when actually they weren't. And the point of what a prophet is to do is to restore the understanding of Torah so that people would keep it properly and to keep it exactly what it says. That's why Mashiach Yehoshua said these exact words, to bring restoration back. Then it goes to say in verse 9, then he went to enter the synagogue, and there was a man who had a withered hand, and he asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they might accuse him. Now once again, when they looked at the issues of Torah, they did not understand that healing on Shabbat was absolutely permissible. And the Torah teaches us this. The Torah teaches us that specifically the Malacha of Shabbat is only in relationship to the very things in which God tells us in the Torah was specifically incumbent upon what was the purpose of Shabbat. And that's why Mashiach Yehoshua tells us that the purpose of Shabbat specifically has to be understood, because if I'm not keeping Shabbat correctly, then I don't understand the purpose of Shabbat. If I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing on the Sabbath, I don't understand the reasons of why I'm doing these things or not doing these things on Shabbat. And one of the things that obviously the people had known at the time period is that Mashiach Yehoshua would heal people on the Shabbat. And of course, here the sages, once again, they struggled with this issue of him healing on Shabbat, because they didn't know that the Torah permits to bring a person to be healed on the Sabbath. And this specific thing that we see here is, it says the man had a withered hand, which means that he had everything that was needed. This guy was not a guy who had a missing eye. This wasn't a guy who had a missing leg. This was not permissible to bring a man's leg to be completely restored to new. This is not what the Torah says. The Torah is only talking about wounds that were made that could be healed, because all of the things that were there to make it be brought back to anew. And so he says, the man with a withered hand asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they might accuse him. So he asked him, he says, which one of you has a sheep? If it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not hold it up and lift it out? How much more value is man than a sheep? So is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? So then he stretched forth, he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored healthy like the others. But the Parushim, they went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. And Yehoshua, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all. The story tells us that, when we're dealing with the issue that we find here in the scriptures, that he points to the issue of the sheep, is he was pointing to the fact that the Pharisees knew that if a animal was caught in a ditch, that you were required to take the animal out of the ditch, because it was a detriment to the animal to be stuck in the ditch, and that it was permissible on the Shabbat to do so. And his point of what he was trying to say is, with regard to this issue, is if God permits us to do a kind act by which helps the animal not struggle and not be harmed any further in this area, how much more is a human being more precious than an animal? Because the issue that you find with regard to what they were saying is they looked at this man as saying, why is this man willing to go about and heal people on the Sabbath? And so Mashiach Yehoshua turns to him and says, why are you willing to go about and help your animal on the Sabbath? It's not an animal worth less than a human? Do you look at an animal in the same way you look at a human life? Of course not. So how much more so is the human life more important than an animal? If you're willing to help an animal, how much more so should you be willing to help a man? And we find that the issue as we get is strictly connected to the Sabbath, because as we go further, we find that this issue pops up again. And we find that when Mashiach Yehoshua is beginning to heal on the Sabbath, that we will see in Luke chapter 13 verse 10, that this issue of healing goes up. And we're going to see this here. So 13 verse 10 says, now he was teaching in the synagogue on Shabbat, and when there was a woman who had a disabled spirit for 18 years, she was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. So Yehoshua, when he saw her, he called out over and he said to her, woman, you're freed from your disability. Now, it says in verse 10, and he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. But when the rulers of the synagogue, meaning the sages of the synagogue, were indigent because Yehoshua had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, there are 6 days by which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on Shabbat. Now here we find Mashiach Yehoshua. He completely sees that the guy understood the fact of the issue, that the subject that he was arguing against and that they had fought against with regard to Mashiach Yehoshua is the issue of Malacha, because this is the issue what he's bringing up here. Malacha. And the Malacha, which the guy thought was forbidden to heal on the Sabbath, Mashiach Yehoshua goes and responds to the fact of knowing this guy is being, he's lying, he's twisting it to make people think that what he was doing is bad, because it was the required duty of the sages of the synagogue to be the ones that would pray and anoint the people in the congregation and to pray for their healing, that they may be healed. And here we find they weren't doing this in this congregation, and yet the guy wanted to save face as to order to make it look like what this person had done was not good. And so he pretends like as if this whole issue was really bad, and so that's why he makes his statement. Therefore, there are 6 days in the week you ought to have done work. Come on those days and be healed, and on a Shabbat day. Then Yehoshua says, then the Lord says, you hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger, and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Hasatan had bound for 18 years, be loose from this bound on the Sabbath? And you find that we see that this thing here was a spiritual attack that had placed against this woman. And Mashiach Yehoshua teaches us that the why reason have people have palsy, or why do people have different physical inabilities, the twitchings and stuff, or why they have deformities that start to. These are all demonic attacks, Mashiach Yehoshua said. And he said, I cannot believe you're willing to sit there and make a woman think that she had to sit here and be stuck in this position. But the Torah teaches us that this is a malacha that is mutar. And therefore, we find that when people think and say, well, I'm confused because, I read in the Talmud or the Mishnah and stuff that they actually were doing this. This is all a lie. You have to understand this. After Mashiach Yehoshua had stood up against the sages had to change everything and make it look like they were actually not like this, because they didn't like the fact that the Brit Chadashah was really pointing out all the truth of what they were really doing, while the Talmud or the Mishnah was created later had to lie about everything about what Mashiach Yehoshua said and did to make it look like that's not really what they held. They did believe in Pekuach Nefesh issues. They did believe this is not true. This is why Mashiach Yehoshua said very clearly and point blank, he said that these people, what were they going to do? He says that they were going to take his rulings after they had murdered Messiah, and then they were going to apply it upon themselves as if they're the ones who came up with this idea. And this is the following thing of what Mashiach Yehoshua prophesied, and this is the truth of it. So if you read the Talmud, if you've read the Mishnah, you thought this was true, it's a lie. It's not true. The Brit Chadashah tells us exactly what the Pharisees were believing, exactly where they understood, and how much they really did understand. And honestly, if you read the Brit Chadashah, you realize the Parashim did not understand as much as they're trying to lie to you when you read the Talmud or the Mishnah. And, if you're reading the Talmud and the Mishnah, I suggest you throw the book away and get rid of it, because it's causing you to err tremendously. There's nothing but false water in it. It's poison. You're drinking the wrong stuff. You're not getting the true teachings. The Brit Chadashah is telling us exactly what it is that they held and what it is that they were doing and what it is they were doing wrong. And that's why the sages hated him so much, is because he just was constantly correcting them and constantly putting their words in front of them as to what they were doing as being wrong and shameful. But the people, they didn't like it. So, as we see in verse 17, he finishes and says, and then he said to these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced, and all the glorious things were done by him. So, Mashiach Yehoshua, he completely made the sages look like absolute fools, because instead of wanting to take care of the people and shepherd the people, they just wanted the people to look at them and to think that they just were always going to be under them, and that these men were just, scholars and sages, and they knew everything, and that they were just going to be under absolute subjection to them, and that, they just could never attain to the wisdom and into the holiness of what these sages are like. And Mashiach Yehoshua completely destroyed that image. And he destroyed the image by showing the very fact that the sages, they were supposed to be praying for the people in the congregation. They were supposed to be healing the people in the congregation. And this is what a shepherd really does. And this is what a shepherd really teaches. And this is what Mashiach Yehoshua says that we are to follow and understand when it comes to the issue of leadership. And so when we understand the problems of this, we begin to see the issues that the Parashim, they weren't at all like the way they're trying to present themselves. The Talmud and the Mishnah is just a book of lies. They're not telling the truth. It shows that these guys were liars. They wanted to hide. They wanted to pretend. They wanted to save face. They didn't want to sit there and tell the truth of what really they didn't understand. And they didn't want to sit there and tell the truth of what really they were doing. So this is going to conclude this part 1 series of learning about keeping Shabbat. And we're going to focus more in the next upcoming series of the issues of learning about Shabbat, learning about what Mashiach Yehoshua teaches us, so that we can learn to follow and keep and do just exactly as Mashiach Yehoshua says we're to do, and understand that we're supposed to go back into the Torah even deeper in order to know how to properly Shomer Shabbat. I'll see you next time.